order to understand the celestial foundations of the Triumphal Entry and the Betrayal by Judas Iscariot, we first have to understand the great natural cycles that this sacred myth is clothing in human form. And then we must understand why it is doing so, what messages these great natural motions were being used to convey. So, as the Earth moves through the year, the sun's rising and setting points move further north and south, and so does the path that the sun takes as it arcs through the sky. It's going to rise further and further north as the Earth approaches the June solstice, and then it's going to head and rise further and further south as we approach the December solstice. And that's a function of the fact that the Earth orbits the sun at a tilt, it has an obliquity to its axis. I understand that the sun itself is hurtling through the galaxy, but in this simplified diagram, you can see that the tilt, as the North Pole is tilted most towards the sun, then the arc is going to be towards the north, and it will move further north and further south throughout the year, and that's a function of the tilt of the Earth's axis. We'll get into it in a little more detail. So we can create a circle of the year that is marked by these 4 points where the axial tilt is most towards the sun. That's going to be the high point of the year at the summer solstice. Then there's going to be a crossing point on the way down to the low point of the year, the winter solstice, which for the northern hemisphere is the December solstice, so I put DS and JS as the June solstice. Now that lower half of the year is where the nights are going to be longer than the days, and that was depicted as the underworld. In ancient Egyptian myth, that was the realm of Osiris, the sun down in the underworld. But when Osiris was down in the underworld, he was horizontal. He was dead. But then he rose up again into the vertical column. That was depicted as the vertical Jed column or the vertical Ankh cross, and we'll also see that that was also associated with the palm tree. So let's go into that in a little bit more detail just to make sure everyone understands exactly why this happens. Let's take a look at it from the side. These are the arcs of the sun across the skies. This is a zoom in of what I was trying to draw earlier. For those in the northern hemisphere, the sun's going to have its highest arc when the North Pole is pointing most directly towards the sun. So that is called the summer solstice. It's the June solstice, and that's that arc there. But when the Earth gets around to the other side and the South Pole is pointing most towards the sun, then the sun will travel along its lowest arc in the northern hemisphere. And if we were to depict the cycle of the year as a great circle, you can imagine the sun going back and forth between these two highest points, the highest point and the lowest point, the summer solstice down to the winter solstice, as being the top and the bottom of this circle. And halfway in between, there's going to be a crossover point. And so the motion of the sun between that highest arc and that lowest arc actually creates 4 points on the circle. The highest point, that's the summer solstice. The lowest point, that's the winter solstice. And then 2 crossing points in between as the arc moves from the highest point down to the lowest point. It's going to cross over and then get to the point where nights become longer than days, and then it'll get down to the lowest point, and then as it comes back up, it'll cross again. Days will become longer than nights on its way up to the highest point. So obviously in the northern hemisphere, days are going to be longer than nights. As we get to that June solstice, the summer solstice, days will be longest there, and then once we reach that longest day, the days will turn around and start getting shorter, and they'll get shorter and shorter, and there'll be a crossing point where they become shorter than nights, and we enter the lower half of the year on the way down to that shortest day at the December solstice. And once we reach that shortest day, the lowest arc, it turns back around and days start to get longer again, and they head back up to where they actually cross over and days become longer on the way back up to the June solstice or the summer solstice for the northern hemisphere. So we have the two high points of the solstices, and then we have the two crossing points in between. Those are the equinoxes at September and March. And then we can further subdivide using the zodiac signs, and this is going to become important now for our celestial allegory. As we go back and forth throughout the year, we can subdivide further, and at that highest point, the zodiac sign, the highest point during the age of Aries, the summer solstice, falls between the signs of Gemini and Cancer at the top of the wheel. Cancer the crab. Now, the zodiac constellation of Cancer the crab looks like that trapezoid that I've drawn in the middle there with the two outstretched arms. And the reason we can divide the year into signs, let me just show you really quickly. The zodiac constellations are the constellations arranged along the same path that the sun moves through. And so as the earth moves around the sun, the background is going to change throughout the year as our position moves relative to the sun. So the sun is going to rise. There's going to be a different background constellation as the sun rises, and it's going to change about once a month because there's 12 zodiac signs. So the sign, the constellation that the sun is rising, that you see in the sky right before the sun rises, that determines the zodiac sign that we're in. And we're using the age of Aries here, which is a preceding age. It's not the age that we're in anymore. Now, as we saw on that zodiac wheel, the sign of Cancer the crab begins at the summer solstice in the age of Aries. And those outstretched arms were also depicted by the ancient Egyptians as the outstretched arms of the scarab beetle. And they were also shown as kind of like what I call the yoga arms, those upraised arms of praise or of triumph. Those are the same outstretched arms from the constellation Cancer, from that scarab beetle, and that you see in the Ankh. That is the top of the year. This is the top of the year is the city on the hill. It's the golden city. And that's why when Christ enters Jerusalem, we have symbology that has to do with the top of the year, and specifically imagery that has to do with the constellation Cancer the crab. Now I've drawn Cancer the crab here, that trapezoid, and I've drawn two arrows pointing to two special stars in the constellation Cancer that were known as Acellus, or still are known, Acellus borealis, the northern donkey colt, and the southern donkey colt, Acellus australis, the southern donkey colt. And so that is why during the triumphal entry, when Jesus is coming into the heavenly city, the city on a hill, the highest point of the year, the summer solstice, he instructs his disciples, two disciples specifically, Gemini, to go get a donkey and the colt of a donkey. Actually, the actual text says an ass and the colt of an ass. That is a clear reference to Acellus borealis and Acellus australis in the constellation of Cancer the crab, because it's impossible to ride on both a donkey and the colt of a donkey. This is a reference back to Zechariah 9:9, and it's also a reference to this constellation Cancer the crab, and as we'll see, it's also a reference to the Old Testament figure of Issachar. The 12 disciples in the New Testament personify the 12 signs of the zodiac, just as the 12 children of Israel in the Old Testament. And Judas Iscariot is linguistically analogous to Issachar. And in Genesis 49, verse 14, we're told that Issachar is an ass crouching down between two burdens. Once again, the reference to an ass is a reference to Acellus Borealis and Acellus Australis in the constellation Cancer, and also the fact that Cancer is at that dividing point between the time when the sun is going upwards towards the top of the year and then the dividing point where the sun begins to go back downward. He's at a resting point. He's at a dividing point in the year. He's at the solstice where the sun appears to stand still. It's like a pause before it begins to plunge back downward towards the winter solstice. And interestingly enough, in the Gospel according to Mark, in chapter 11, verse 4, we're told that the disciples find the colt at a place where two ways meet, two roads meet. Now, interestingly enough, when the sun reaches the summer solstice and it kisses that highest point of the year, that's when it turns around and begins to plunge back down towards the crossing point of the equinox. That's where it will plunge back underneath into the underworld again. And so when the sun's rays get all the way up to the Tropic of Cancer, and remember Judas Iscariot is connected with the constellation or the sign of Cancer. And when that sun kisses that line, then it begins the downward motion back towards the lower half of the year. Now, I'd just like to show very quickly one piece of evidence that shows that the palm is also associated with the top of the year and the upstretched arms. This is from an ancient Egyptian lintel from the pyramid of Amenemhet the First, who reigned beginning in 1991 BC. And you can see these are actually palm leaves on the outside. They're palm ribs. They're notched. They have to do with the cycles of time. And those palm notches, you can see there's a figure with upraised arms on either side, the top of the year symbol. And this is actually a symbol of the two kingdoms. The upper and lower half of the year is what I believe the two kingdoms may actually be referring to. Here's another piece of art from ancient Egypt also showing the vertical palm, and like I said, I believe that is the solstice line, the vertical column, and it's in between two apes in this amulet. They are the horizontal line, and this actually gets to what these cycles and what all these star myths actually mean. And what I believe that these star myths are depicting is the horizontal line is being cast down into incarnation and matter, the lower half of the year, the underworld. But the stars, that represents the invisible world, the realm of spirit, the realm of the gods, and that is the fact that each and every individual human being has a dual nature, a physical nature and a spiritual component. And we dwell in a universe that is also dual. It has a physical, material, visible nature, but it's actually connected to and interpenetrated by at all times the invisible world, the spirit world, and that as human beings we actually reflect and embody the universe. And that means we're actually always, whether we know it or not, in touch with or capable of contact with the invisible world, the spirit world, and the ramifications of that teaching are profound.